I always thought I knew my life like the back of my hand. 30 years of marriage to Nancy, two wonderful grown-up daughters, a nice house in the Chicago suburbs. All of it was my pride and joy. After her death last winter from cancer, I had been slowly learning to live with this emptiness. This morning, I finally decided to clean out the attic. My daughters had asked me 100 times, but I always found an excuse. The air smelled of sawdust, old books, and that something else we call the scent of childhood. I sifted through boxes of Christmas decorations we hadn't used in years, old photo albums, the grandchildren's childhood drawings. Then my hand brushed against something hard beneath a pile of old newspapers. Moving them aside, I saw a small metal box I had never noticed before. It was hidden, as if someone had deliberately kept it from me. My palms grew damp as I picked it up. The box was locked with a tiny latch, but it gave way easily when I pressed it with my pocket knife. Inside were letters, dozens of envelopes, neatly tied together with a blue ribbon, the color of my late wife's eyes. My heart pounded faster when I recognized the handwriting on the envelopes. It was that of my best friend, Mike. The oldest letter was dated 1992, a year before our wedding. I didn't dare open it. I just sat on the cold attic floor, holding in my hands proof that everything I thought I knew about my life might have been a lie. Outside, rain began to drizzle, just like on the day we buried Nancy. And suddenly, I realized this box didn't just contain letters. It held a truth I might never have been ready to hear. I sat on the attic floor, chained to that damned box as if it were electrified. The rain outside grew heavier, its monotonous tapping a reminder of time slipping away, second by second, my former life dissolving before my eyes. My fingers trembled as I pulled out the first letter. The paper was thin, almost translucent with age, but the words remained sharp, like knife cuts. "My dearest Mike," it began, and that alone sent a sharp pain through my chest. I read as she confessed her love for him, her fear of our wedding, how she had wept in his arms the night before the ceremony. One passage struck me like a blow. "When Bob touches me, I close my eyes and pretend it's you." My jaw clenched until it ached. Tears that hadn't come at the funeral now fell onto the paper, smearing the ink but not washing away the betrayal. As I scanned the dates, I made a horrifying discovery. The letters came at regular intervals, every 2 or 3 months for all 30 years, even after the children were born, even after Mike married her friend Susan, even when she was in the hospital after the accident. I remembered how Mike was always the first to show up when we had problems, how he'd drop by unexpectedly whenever I was away, how Nancy always knew his tastes in music, books, food, things I'd assumed she didn't care about. The box slipped from my hands, scattering the evidence of my naive happiness across the floor. I stood up, my knees buckling. As I descended the stairs, I already knew. Now I'd have to decide, live with this truth or find Mike and demand answers that might destroy me completely. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of my own groaning. An empty whiskey bottle on the nightstand bore witness to my failed attempt to numb the pain, but alcohol had only sharpened the memories. The sun hadn't yet risen when I found myself at the window, staring into the suburban darkness. The phone lay on the table. One call, and I'd get the truth from Mike. But what would I even say? How do you demand a confession from someone you once called a brother? My hand reached for the screen on its own, but froze inches away. I opened the drawer. Inside were photos of Nancy and me. She was laughing on the beach during our 20th anniversary trip. Her eyes sparkled, but now I couldn't see anything in that gaze except lies. Had we ever been happy, or had she just been playing a role? Then I remembered. Mike had been the one to suggest that anniversary cruise. "Go relax, I'll watch the kids," he'd said. Nancy had been so excited. Now I knew why. I stepped into the garden. The cold night air burned my lungs. Somewhere in the dark, her favorite roses were blooming, the only thing I hadn't destroyed in my rage. Back inside, I picked up the phone. This time, I dialed my daughter's number. "Dad, it's 3 a.m.? Her voice was thick with sleep and concern. I closed my eyes. How do I tell her her entire history is a lie? "Just wanted to hear your voice," I whispered, then hung up. The screen lit up with a photo, all of us together at the last family reunion. Nancy, me, the kids. and Mike with his wife, standing slightly apart. Now, I saw what I'd refused to notice for years, the weight of his gaze as it lingered on my wife. I made my decision. Tomorrow, I would see Mike, alone. No words, no explanations, just me looking into his eyes. Maybe then I'd understand whether he had truly loved her, or if he'd just been laughing at me all these years. The sun was just beginning to rise as I sat in my old pickup truck outside Mike's house. 30 years of friendship meant I knew his routine by heart. He always left for his morning run at 6:30. My fingers drummed against the steering wheel. I'd imagined this conversation 100 different ways, but none answered the one question burning inside me. Why? Why had they done this? Why him? Of all people. He stepped out in those familiar gray sweatpants, the ones I'd given him for his 50th birthday. He squinted against the sunlight, just like he had 20 years ago when we'd gone fishing at the lake. I took a deep breath. The smell of coffee from my thermos mixed with the scent of his favorite flowers. White lilies, the same kind Nancy had loved. Now the coincidence felt sinister. Mike walked toward the gate, stretching, then froze when he saw my truck. His face shifted, surprise, then understanding, then something I'd never seen before. Something between fear and relief. I got out. My legs felt weak, but I couldn't back down now. He stood just a few steps away, his hands trembling slightly. We stared at each other in silence, and in that quiet, there was more truth than in all those letters combined. His gaze dropped to the envelope in my hand. I didn't even remember grabbing it. Then he took a step forward, and I saw tears in my best friend's eyes. Tears that told me everything I needed to know. I raised a hand to stop him. I wasn't ready to hear the words yet. I wanted just a little longer in a world where the truth wasn't final. Back in the truck, I felt something inside me shatter, but it wasn't pain anymore, just the hollow space left behind when you finally let go of what you've held on to for too long. I drove home slower than usual, as if trying to postpone the moment I'd have to step back into that house where everything reminded me of her. The envelope from the attic lay on the passenger seat like a living thing, breathing my betrayal. I stopped in the driveway, staring at the clearing where Nancy and I had our first picnic after buying this property. She'd laughed when I spilled wine on the new blanket. Now I wondered, had she laughed about it later with Mike? The living room smelled of dust and loneliness. I sank into her favorite armchair, the spot where she used to read in the evenings while I assumed she was just lost in a book. Now I imagined her sitting there, thinking of him. I pulled out the last letter from the box, the one written a month before her diagnosis. The paper still carried her perfume, but now the scent brought bitterness instead of tenderness. She wrote about her fear of aging, about dreading the loss of his attention. Not a single word about me. I was folding the letter back into the envelope when I noticed the small postmark in the corner, sent from our local post office. The same one I visited every Friday to buy newspapers. She'd been mailing these to him while I stood in line just meters away. In the kitchen, I poured myself whiskey but didn't drink it, just watched sunlight dance in the amber liquid. And then it hit me. I no longer wanted revenge or answers. The exhaustion from the pain outweighed the anger. I walked to the fireplace where Nancy and I used to sit during winter nights. Without hesitation, I tossed the envelope into the ashes. Watched as flames consumed her words. No trace remained, just a faint paper scent that quickly faded, just like my need to know the whole truth. The shadow of the flames danced on the walls as I sat before the fireplace, watching the last corner of paper turn to ash. Strangely, I felt neither relief nor fresh pain, just a peculiar emptiness, as if someone had carried away something important from the house, and I couldn't remember what. For morning coffee, I went to the same diner where Mike and I had met every Friday for the past 20 years. The waitress who knew us both gave me a curious look when I ordered for one. I drank my coffee hot, staring at our usual table by the window, imagining how it would sit empty now. Back home, I found the box of Nancy's things I'd been preparing for the girls. Photographs, a necklace, old diaries. All of it meant to become their inheritance. My fingers brushed the cover of one diary, but I didn't open it. Not today. Maybe not for a long time. In the garden, her roses were blooming, red as her lips used to be when she laughed at my jokes. I cut a few and put them in a vase in the kitchen. For the first time in years, I did it not out of grief, but simply because they were beautiful. That evening, I scrolled to the last photo of the three of us, taken after a round of golf last summer. Nancy stood in the middle, arms around us both. Now I saw what I'd missed then, how her hand gripped Mike's shoulder just a little tighter than mine. I stepped onto the porch. The air smelled of rain and earth. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Life was moving on, indifferent to my revelations. And to my surprise, I realized I wanted to move on too, not forgetting, but not cursing either. Tomorrow I'd call the girls, maybe even Mike, but not today. Today I'd just sit here, listening to the wind whisper through the leaves all the things I'd never said, all these years. The morning sun filtered through the curtains as I woke with an unfamiliar lightness, as if the boulder that had been crushing my chest for weeks had suddenly vanished. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, remembering my dream. Nancy, young again in that blue dress she loved, standing by the lake and laughing. Not with Mike, not with me, just laughing. I brewed coffee, still making enough for two out of habit, though I lived alone now. The phone sat on the table. I picked it up, replaying the last few days in my mind. The letters, the rage, the emptiness. Then that moment by the fireplace when I burned the last proof. My fingers dialed on their own. Mike answered after the first ring, as if he'd been waiting. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. "Let's meet," I finally said, my voice steadier than I expected. The cafe was quiet. Mike sat at our usual table, but now there was an empty space between us, just enough to hold all the truth we'd carried. He looked older than I remembered. I placed an old photo on the table, the three of us at Susan's wedding. Nancy in white, she'd been the maid of honor. Mike in a tux, me with a camera in hand. "I don't need the details," I said as the waitress brought our coffee. Mike nodded, his eyes dry but holding something that needed no words. We drank in silence. When I stood to leave, Mike reached out, not for a handshake, just a touch on my shoulder like he'd done 30 years ago when we were boys. Outside, the sun was shining. I walked slowly, feeling the weight in my chest dissolve. I returned home at dusk for the first time in years, unafraid of the silence waiting in the empty house. In the living room, I took her photo from the shelf, the one of her laughing on the beach, and put it back, no longer hiding it in the corner. Tomorrow I'd call the girls, maybe invite them over. But for now, I just sat in my chair, listening to the old clock on the wall mark the seconds of a new life. I woke before dawn, as the first rays of sun began gilding the edge of the attic, that very attic where it all began. Today was the first morning I didn't feel the need to go back up there. Instead, I laced up my old sneakers and went for a morning walk, something I hadn't done in years. The air smelled fresh after last night's rain. I wandered the same streets where Nancy and I used to stroll in the early years of our marriage, when we still dreamed of a house and children. Now I saw these places differently, not through the lens of betrayal, but simply as part of my life, which, it turns out, had its share of happy moments too. Near the park, I paused by the bench where Mike and I used to sit, making plans for the future. Now a young couple sat there, laughing and holding hands. I walked past without pain, just a faint whisper of nostalgia. I returned home with fresh bagels, the kind my daughters loved as children. In the kitchen, making coffee, I noticed their childhood photo on the fridge. Nancy hugging them both, me standing nearby, smiling. That moment had been real, even if another truth had lurked in the shadows. I picked up my phone and did what I hadn't dared for months, started a group chat with the girls. "If you're not ashamed of your old man, maybe visit this weekend?" I typed, no emojis, but without the bitterness that had become my default. Their replies came instantly, first from the younger, then the older. Just like that, as if nothing had happened. I stepped into the garden. The roses bloomed lavishly, as if aware they'd been tended with special care. Today I didn't search their petals for hints of the past. I just watched sunlight dance on the red blossoms and thought how life, it turns out, can still be beautiful, even after all the revelations. Tomorrow, the girls will come. Maybe they'll bring the grandchildren. But today I'll just sit in the garden, listening to the birds sing, marveling at how easy it is to breathe when you finally let go of what was never truly yours to keep.